I'm Marina Kellerman, 29, and on the morning my family gathered 12 relatives in my parents' dining room. My father slid a stack of documents toward me with the quiet certainty of someone closing a door he'd locked long before I arrived, murmuring that it was time for me to make this official. My mother folded her arms as if bracing the room for impact and told me I had never been a reliable choice, while Claudia sat at the head of the table with the kind of stillness that doesn't need words to declare ownership. I felt every gaze settle on the empty chair beside me as I opened the folder and saw my name printed above a line that waited for my signature like a final verdict. I picked up the pen because silence in that room had always been the currency of survival, and the moment the tip touched paper, my mother released a small breath, as if the entire family had been holding it for her. My father watched the motion without blinking, as though my compliance confirmed a story he'd rehearsed long before this Sunday was chosen, while Claudia leaned back just enough for the chandelier to catch her smile. When I closed the folder, the table didn't shift, didn't question, didn't ask if I understood what I'd just surrendered. I stood, steady in a way that surprised me, and the scrape of my chair against the floor became the only sound anyone bothered to acknowledge as I walked past a row of relatives pretending to study the centerpiece. My father reminded me to leave the pen. My mother whispered that clarity was a gift, and Claudia tilted her head with a look that suggested inevitability rather than victory. At the doorway, I glanced down at the edge of the signature page and noticed a faint handwritten mark small, deliberate, and out of place in a document meant to be pristine. When I drove back to Milwaukee that night, the city felt smaller than I remembered, and by the time I unlocked my studio the next morning, an email waited with a single line explaining that the client was moving in a different direction, though the project had been confirmed for weeks. I stared at the renderings still taped to my wall and whispered that I could adjust the timeline if they needed. But the only answer was the silence of an empty inbox that had once carried steady work. By noon, another message arrived, this one warmer in tone but colder in intent, mentioning concern about recent family issues and wishing me luck finding stability. I tried to salvage the week by calling a long-term homeowner I'd worked with, and she hesitated before mentioning that people in her neighborhood association were cautious because they'd heard something unsettling about my situation, as if my name had become a warning rather than a signature on a design plan. The quiet in her voice lodged itself under my ribs, and when she apologized for backing out, it carried the shape of a decision already influenced by someone else. By the time the call ended, the blueprint on my drafting table might as well have belonged to a stranger. Reaching for help felt like scraping against an old bruise. But I dialed Uncle Dennis, hoping for some thread of grounding, and he breathed heavily before saying he couldn't involve himself in matters that the family had settled. A phrase that landed sharper than he intended. I looked around my studio, still lined with samples I'd bought on a shoestring, and felt the room tilt as the cancellations stacked together like a verdict delivered without a hearing. When the sun set against the frosted windows, the last notification of the day came from a colleague hinting that whatever had happened in Connecticut was traveling fast across the Midwest. Diana found me 3 days after the last client backed out, walking into the cafe where I was pretending to work and studying my rough sketches before asking whether the portfolio online was really mine. And her voice carried the kind of calm certainty that made the room feel less hostile. I watched her sit across from me with a confidence I hadn't felt in months. And when she mentioned a stalled boutique hotel project in Santa Fe that needed a designer who can see past wreckage, the invitation landed with the weight of someone offering direction rather than rescue. She studied my hesitation only long enough to add that opportunity rarely stays in one place, and asked if I was willing to leave Wisconsin before whatever rumor followed me finished the job. I tried to steady my breath as she described the property, a half-finished concept waiting for someone who still believed in their own eye, and the way she framed it made the silence around me shift, as though I'd been given a door I didn't have to beg for. The offer wasn't wrapped in sympathy. It came with a clarity I hadn't heard from anyone in weeks. And when she said there was space for me in New Mexico if I was ready to work, not hide, something inside me aligned with the directness of her words. I closed my sketchbook and realized my hands had stopped shaking. And in that small stillness, I told her I'd go. By the end of that afternoon, the decision felt less like escape and more like stepping towards something that finally matched the way I wanted my life to sound. And Diana nodded once, as if she'd expected that answer from the moment she approached my table. Packing my studio that night, I noticed how quiet the room had become without the constant interruption of cancellations. And the absence of those messages felt like proof that Milwaukee no longer held a place for me. When I locked the door for the last time, the only thing I carried with me was her sentence echoing in my mind. "There's room for you if you want it, and for the first time since Connecticut." The words didn't feel conditional. Santa Fe greeted me with a kind of dry warmth that made the air feel steadier. And the hotel project Diana wanted me to see stood at the edge of a quiet street, half-formed and waiting for someone willing to imagine it finished. She walked me through the gutted lobby, while noting that the previous designer had abandoned the job midstream, adding that if I could see a story in this mess, the place might finally have a chance. And the bluntness in her tone fit the stripped-down walls around us. I traced the outline of the old reception desk and told her I could already picture how the light would fall once the windows were reopened. The following weeks folded into a rhythm I hadn't felt since before Connecticut. And each morning carried the sound of contractors asking where I wanted framing shifted, or whether the tile direction mattered to the line of sight from the entrance. Diana stopped by only when necessary, always with the same quiet expectation that I could handle whatever the day required. And when she reviewed the first completed wing, her only remark, "This feels intentional," landed with more weight than praise from anyone else ever had. I realized then how rarely I'd been trusted to own the shape of something without defending every decision. As momentum built, Diana invited me to formalize our work by launching Kellerman Studio Collective. And she noted that she would contribute seed funding if I wanted to set down roots rather than drift from project to project. I agreed before doubt had time to catch up. And the moment the paperwork was filed, inquiries began arriving from local property owners who had seen early photos of the remodel. By the time the hotel's opening date was announced, the once empty stretch of days I'd carried in Milwaukee had been replaced by a full calendar and a sense that the ground beneath me had finally stopped sliding. The first time Caleb contacted me, he introduced himself as a real estate attorney reviewing a land deal in Albuquerque and mentioned that my name had come up in a way he found unusual. The kind of word that makes the air turn still. And he asked if I could meet him because there was something I needed to see. I drove to his office expecting a zoning question tied to the hotel project, but he opened his laptop instead and turned the screen toward me, explaining that a cautionary email had been circulated to several firms and that it warned recipients to avoid professional dealings with me due to financial misconduct within her family. My pulse kicked hard when he added that the sender used their corporate address without hesitation, almost as if they assumed no one would challenge the language. I leaned closer and read the signature at the bottom, Claudia's name printed cleanly beneath a title she'd chased for years, and the room narrowed to a single fixed point as I tried to understand how long this message had been circulating without my knowledge. Caleb watched my expression tighten and remarked that the phrasing was reckless enough to be actionable, then asked whether I'd been aware anyone was interfering with my contracts in Wisconsin. I told him cancellations had hit one after another with no explanation. And the moment the words left my mouth, the pattern I'd tried to outrun arranged itself with brutal clarity. He scrolled to a second email, forwarded internally among brokers, repeating the same allegation and advising that I lacked financial stability. An accusation sharp enough to cut through every professional introduction I'd ever built. Caleb tapped the screen lightly and noted that this kind of interference could damage long-term prospects if left unchecked, adding that the law views intentional disruption of contracts as more than personal hostility. I felt the weight of that distinction settle as I asked what my options were, and he answered that preserving evidence was the first step, followed by a decision about whether I wanted the sender to understand the consequences of distributing false information. When I walked out of his office, the printout of Claudia's email felt heavier than paper should allow. not because of the words themselves, but because each line matched the unexplained fractures in my career that had trailed me from Milwaukee to Santa Fe. The parking lot hummed with late afternoon heat as I stood beside my car, and the only thought I could hold steady was that the damage I'd tried to shrug off had never been accidental. The months after Caleb handed me the evidence moved with a momentum I hadn't anticipated. And as the hotel neared completion, inquiries began arriving from galleries and property owners across the Southwest who wanted the same clarity they'd seen in the remodel. Diana reminded me that visibility carries its own kind of responsibility and nudged me toward the local design circuit, noting that people need to see the face behind the work before the pace outgrew my capacity. I agreed reluctantly, surprised by how quickly my calendar filled with site visits that once would have taken years to secure. The launch of Kellerman Studio Collective drew more attention than either of us expected. And during the first showcase, a developer approached me with a gentle nod and remarked that the hotel project felt like someone finally bothered to listen to what the building wanted. A comment that stayed with me long after he walked away. By summer, commissions from Santa Fe, Taos, and Albuquerque arrived in steady sequence, each one reinforcing that the version of myself I'd fought to defend in Wisconsin had found firmer ground here. I learned to navigate the growing demand with a steadiness that matched the landscape, and the forward pull of each project left less room for the doubt I'd carried from the Midwest. When a regional magazine featured the hotel in a piece about emerging design voices in the Southwest, Diana forwarded the link with a short line telling me not to downplay what I'd built, and her conviction eased the last fractures left by the cancellations that once defined my days. The attention wasn't loud or overnight. It gathered gradually, shaped by work rather than apology, and I realized the shift fully when a contractor introduced me to his crew as the one setting the tone out here. Standing on the edge of another foundation marked for redesign, I recognized a quiet truth in his words. The ground beneath me no longer moved. And for the first time in a long while, I was the one determining where to stand. The gala in Denver carried the kind of polished noise that makes everyone speak half a notch louder. And as Diana and I moved through the crowd, I heard my name drifting across a nearby table just before Claudia remarked that I was doing small regional projects and that the hotel had been a lucky break. Her tone clipped enough to draw a few sympathetic nods. Diana's attention sharpened at the sound of it, and she leaned in with a calm spark in her voice as she told the group that we had closed an $8 million redevelopment deal that afternoon and that I was leading the design because vision only matters when someone can actually execute it, a line that settled over the table like a pulled thread. Claudia stiffened as the conversation shifted, and I watched her grip her glass while the people she'd been entertaining turned toward me with new curiosity, their questions suddenly shaped by numbers rather than pity. My father stood a few feet away, pretending not to have heard any of it, though his eyes found mine with a mixture of confusion and calculation, as if he were trying to reconcile the daughter he'd dismissed in Connecticut with the one now being introduced as a principal force behind a major project. When he stepped closer and asked quietly whether the deal was real, I told him it had been in negotiation for months, and that Diana trusted me with every architectural decision. And the truth of it made his expression falter in a way I had never seen. The room hummed with polite conversation, but beneath it, I felt a seam give way. The kind that doesn't snap loudly so much as shift the entire structure around it. A developer approached to congratulate us, noting that the hotel renovation in Santa Fe had become a reference point for clean, adaptive design. And Claudia exhaled sharply, as if the comment had landed directly against whatever narrative she'd carried into the evening. Diana responded before I could speak, mentioning that we were expanding the studio footprint in the region and that collaboration inquiries were already exceeding capacity. And her certainty made the circle around us widen with interest. I saw my mother at the edge of the crowd watching the interaction unfold, her features tightening as she calculated how many people had just witnessed a version of me she could no longer frame as unstable or unreliable. The rest of the evening passed with introductions, questions, and a steady stream of conversations that placed me at the center rather than the periphery. and each exchange peeled another layer off the story my family had built about me. When the lights dimmed for the closing remarks, I felt the weight of their silence behind me, my father unsure, my mother guarded, Claudia furious, and the contrast between their stillness and the momentum gathering around my work clarified something I had not dared articulate until that moment. I walked out of the ballroom knowing the balance had shifted, not because I'd fought them, but because the room no longer recognized the version of me they had insisted was real. The week after the gala, Diana and I moved forward on acquiring a parcel in a Denver suburb for the creative hub. And during a routine title review, the broker paused when he saw my name listed as the design lead, noting that their legal team had encountered my family situation before and wanted updated financials to avoid complications. I felt the echo of Wisconsin tighten across my ribs as he explained that someone in a related network had flagged me months earlier. And when Diana reminded him that Kellerman Studio Collective had cleared every funding benchmark and carried no liabilities, the shift in his posture showed he hadn't expected resistance. He excused himself to confer with his attorney, leaving us in a conference room that hummed with the kind of silence born from someone realizing their assumptions no longer held. By the afternoon, the legal team requested confirmation of my firm's valuation, and Caleb sent a full packet with a short note stating that our documentation was current, solvent, and independently verified, a phrase that dismantled whatever rumor the brokers had clung to. When the packet landed in their inbox, the broker returned with a polite stiffness and mentioned that the concern had stemmed from informal information circulated last year, a careful way of admitting the damage Claudia's email had caused without speaking her name. Diana responded first, pointing out that relying on unverified claims can jeopardize a legitimate transaction, and the flush that rose on his face made it clear he understood the implication. Later that evening, I learned through a colleague that word of my involvement had reached my father's old associates, and one of them had already called him to ask why his daughter was leading a multi-million-dollar project after he'd described me as unstable. I imagined the pause on the other end of the line as he tried to reconcile two incompatible versions of me, one built from his narrative and one built from my work. And for the first time, the imbalance between those stories tilted toward the truth. The deal moved forward without further hesitation, but the residue of that moment stayed with me, the unmistakable evidence that my name, once used to undermine me, now carried weight that could not be dismissed. Caleb issued the cease and desist on a Wednesday morning, and within an hour my phone lit up with Claudia's number, her voice already tight as she demanded to know whether I had lost my mind by dragging her firm into something she called a misunderstanding. I let her talk until she ran out of breath, then told her the letter outlined every instance of her interference and that continuing to circulate false claims would escalate the matter. And the silence that followed snapped with a brittle disbelief as she muttered that I was overreacting to standard professional feedback. I reminded her that standard feedback doesn't involve fabricated misconduct or coordinated attempts to block contracts. And the way she inhaled sharply told me she finally understood the precision of what had been documented. She pivoted fast, insisting she'd only tried to contain damage after hearing I'd separated from the family. But the tremor under her justification betrayed how deeply the cease and desist had landed in her office that morning. I answered that reputation management doesn't require impersonating authority or distributing defamatory warnings, and that her firm now had legal notice of every message traced back to her account. And she responded with a bitter laugh that cracked at the edges, as she asked whether I truly meant to jeopardize her position. I said nothing about intent. I simply repeated that any further interference would activate formal action. And the pause before she replied stretched long enough to reveal the fear beneath her anger. When the call ended, a colleague in Denver texted to say Claudia had been reassigned to internal research, a quiet demotion framed as temporary but understood by everyone as consequence. I stared at the notification for a long moment, aware that the shift wasn't triumph so much as correction, a rebalancing of weight that had been uneven for years. The corridor outside my office felt still in a way that matched the clarity settling in my chest. And for the first time since leaving Wisconsin, The damage she'd inflicted no longer moved unchecked in the world. The letter from my father arrived on a Monday, written in his tight block handwriting, and the first line read that he owed me an apology for believing a story that had never belonged to me, followed by an admission that watching my work in Denver had forced him to confront what he called the damage of certainty. I read it twice before setting it down, remembering the way he couldn't meet my eyes at the gala, and when he wrote that he hoped I might one day let him earn a different place in my life. The words carried a weight that pressed against the years he'd spent choosing Claudia's version of events. The envelope held no excuses, only a quiet acknowledgement that he had stood on the wrong side of the line and understood it too late to undo anything. I didn't call him, but I carried the letter with me to the studio in Santa Fe as contractors finished the final touches. And when Diana walked through the refurbished atrium and murmured that the space felt like it had found its voice, something inside me steadied. Caleb stopped by with updated filings for the collective and mentioned that the hub project in Colorado was moving faster than projected. And hearing him note that the team trusted my direction without hesitation drew a clean contrast to the woman my family had tried to define. I stood in the doorway watching the afternoon light spill across the new flooring, aware that this life had formed not from permission, but from choosing distance when the cost of staying became too sharp. That evening, as the first group of artists settled into the communal workspace, I folded my father's letter and placed it in a drawer, not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as a marker of where the road behind me ended. The studio quieted around us in a way that felt like breath rather than emptiness, and I understood that release sometimes looks like not turning back, even when someone asks you to. I stepped outside into the cooling air of Santa Fe with the sense that the life I was building no longer needed to compete with the one I left behind, and the absence of bitterness felt like the final proof that I had crossed into something new. Thank you for staying with me through this chapter, because sharing it feels like placing a steady hand on the life I've rebuilt and inviting you to stand in the quiet with me. If any part of my journey echoed something in yours, I hope it leaves you reaching toward whatever piece is waiting for you next. And if you choose to return for another story, I'll be here, grateful for the company.